13 years ago, I had my upper stomach and esophagus biopsied for cancer, and thankfully it came back benign, but at that time I had a lot of erosion and I had the beginning of cellular change. And so the specialist told me, you have got to figure out a way to control the amount of stomach acid that you have, because the next time you come back to me and we do a biopsy, if you haven't figured out how to control this and how to heal yourself, you are not going to be so lucky. So I came home and started going through all of the ingredients that I was using to cook food and what was sitting in our cupboards. And I ended up throwing out probably well over half of the things, which meant whenever I went to make something, I had to figure out a different ingredient to use and to substitute in. The good news is I was completely able to heal in 6 months' time. I got off all of my prescription medication. If you want to learn more about that story, you can go and check out this video. But there are a ton of baking substitutions that I have learned over the time. So if it's for health reasons, or it might just simply be you are out of that ingredient, and you don't want to have to run to the store in order to make the recipe, knowing these baking substitutions is going to be key in making your life a lot easier, in some cases, probably healthier. So one of the things that when we are cooking from scratch and baking that we want to look at is the fat source. So there's a lot of things that have some type of fat. And so if you're looking at substituting, it's going to be find something that mimics that fat. If it's in a solid state, so for example, shortening, vegetable shortening is one of the very first things that I cut out. But when I started to bake, I had no idea what was going to work well flavor-wise, as well as texture, because I was so used to using Crisco. Well, one of the easiest substitutions to use is coconut oil or butter. And one of my favorite things about butter when I'm using that is you can use it as a solid. So if it's cold, it's going to be solid. Same with your coconut oil. So it's very similar. You can cut it in, like if you're making pie crust or biscuits, it's something that you can cut in to create those little fat pockets so that when it bakes, you still get that nice flaky texture. The other thing though that you can do with both coconut oil and butter is if you need a liquid, because canola oil was the other, vegetable oil was one of the other oils that I immediately kicked out, but I needed something that tasted mild. If you have ever tried to sub olive oil when you are baking a cake, I did it once. Do not do it. Unless you really like the flavor of olive oil in a cake, which I did not. So I found that melted butter and melted coconut oil, avocado oil also works well because that is a liquid oil that is not a strong flavor profile. Those are the three that I use, but I found for most things, I actually prefer the flavor of melted butter and melted coconut oil, depending on if you are dairy-free or not. And so that's great because this can work as a solid state fat content, as well as melted and liquid. Now, there's a plethora of baking substitutions, and I have got a whole list with all the exact measurements for you to sub different things in, and you can check out that blog post beneath this video description. But some of the things is just different ratios of understanding your acid with your leavening agent. So that means what's going to give some of your baked goods rise. Now, a lot of times people think yeast, but both your baking powder as well as your baking soda, those are also leavening agents, and those can work on pH as well as heat. So baking powder, for example, when it hits a hot oven, there's a reaction that comes there as well as pH level. And that's why when you are adding these, usually you have some type of acidic ingredient, though not always. And they also are activated by liquid. So it's a lot of times where we're adding those to batter. However, sometimes you may have baking powder and you're out of baking soda and the recipe calls for baking soda, or vice versa. You don't have any baking powder, but you have baking soda. And so those are very easy substitutions. If a recipe calls for baking soda and you do not have baking soda, but you've got some vinegar, and you can use either white distilled vinegar or you can use apple cider vinegar. Both of them work fine. And I find when you're baking, you're usually using such a small, minute amount, you don't really notice the flavor difference between the two anyway, so I use those interchangeably. So if a recipe calls for baking powder and you do not have baking powder, you can use a half a teaspoon of vinegar with a 1/4 teaspoon baking soda, and that will equal your baking powder. Now on the flip side, if you have a recipe that calls for baking soda, but you only have baking powder, you simply are going to triple the amount of baking powder for what the recipe calls for baking soda. Now, sometimes you'll have recipes that call for both baking powder and baking soda. So if you don't have any baking soda in that instance, whatever the amount of baking soda is, you're going to triple it for the baking powder, but still include the regular measurement for the baking powder in those recipes that have dual, that they have both of those in there. Now, when it comes to some of your liquid sweeteners, or even if you're using granule sweeteners, you can sub in maple syrup, molasses, and honey interchangeably in recipes. Now, one thing to remember, however, is that it is going to change the flavor profile because molasses, of course, is a much stronger flavor. Actually, this is my molasses. This is my maple syrup. They both look similar bottles there. Of course, molasses is going to have a lot stronger flavor than if you were just using honey. So you may choose to use a smaller amount of that, but then you're going to have to put in some extra liquid because this is liquid. So if you were cutting that amount back on a recipe, say it called for a 1/4 cup honey, you might decide to do an 1/8 cup molasses and then just do an 1/8 cup of water. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if a recipe calls for brown sugar and you are using as a sweetener in the recipe either the maple syrup and especially the molasses, you may decide to omit the brown sugar altogether because you're already going to get that flavor profile from the maple syrup and or the molasses. Now, when it comes to our fats, as well as some of the acid in our baked goods, if you don't have sometimes sour cream or yogurt or different cheeses whenever you're making those, you can substitute those out because yogurt and sour cream are going to be very similar in a baked product. They both have a fat content. They both have the acidicness to them. And so they're going to give the exact same result in a recipe. So I use yogurt interchangeably with sour cream and a lot of the different cheeses, even ricotta. Like you can substitute these in for quite a few. And again, in that blog post, we have all of the different substitutions written out for you. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you go and grab that. Now, what about eggs? A lot of times people will get an egg allergy or maybe you're out of eggs and there's a lot of substitutions you can do for eggs. You can actually use some yogurt. I have used applesauce both in part for an egg substitution as well as oil substitutions. That can work great. And you also can use chia seeds. So you simply will ground these up. You can also do ground flax and you'll let those mix in with your liquid. You can even add a little bit with the applesauce or a little bit with some of the yogurt, or you can use water. And you're gonna let that set and it will become thick and you can use that as a substitution for eggs in any of your baking recipes. Now, some of the other things is vanilla. So homemade vanilla extract, which is extremely easy to make, tastes delicious. Highly recommend that you get your vanilla extract going if you're not making that already. But you can substitute in, there's vanilla paste, there's vanilla sugar, almond extract. You can use different extracts, which of course will give you different flavor profiles, but can be used interchangeably. Now, one of the things that I have not stocked in years is any condensed cream of soup. So if you are making recipes that call for some type of condensed cream soup, you can very easily make quickly homemade condensed chicken soup, homemade your own condensed version of celery, mushroom. All of those are super easy for you to make. They only take a few minutes and they're just common ingredients that I guarantee you already have on hand. So we have that recipe and video to walk you through that as well. The other one of the most versatile things that you can keep is tomato sauce. Generally, when I'm canning, all I make up is salsa and tomato sauce because I know I can use that tomato sauce for condensed tomato soup in recipes. As I said, we haven't bought and condensed any type of soup in well over a decade. You can make tomato paste from your tomato sauce. You can quickly turn that into spaghetti sauce, pizza sauce, ketchup. Any of those things can all be done if you just keep on hand simple, straight tomato sauce. Now, if you don't have vinegar on hand, because a lot of the substitutions use some mixture of vinegar in there, you can use bottled concentrated lemon and or lime juice or even citric acid. And you'll also notice that there's a lot of products here that say Azure Standard. And today's video is sponsored by Azure Standard. I use them to stock my pantry because they have The companies, if it's not their own product, they also bring in products from other small farms and small companies, but they're all done in a manner that's really important to me. So they are non-GMO, they have organic or regenerative practices, and I'm never worried that I'm getting a product that would have things or was made in a manner that I would not be wanting to feed myself and or my family. They also have where you can get things in bulk. So as you can see, here is one of my bulk 5 pounds of baking soda. And I get my maple syrup from them, I get my coconut oil from them, I get my molasses from them, I get a lot of ingredients from them. And if you are a first-time customer, use coupon code Melissa10 on your first order of $50 or more. You can check them out at azurestandard.com. And make sure that you visit that blog post because there are a ton more substitutions that you are going to want to have on hand so that you never have to worry about running out of an ingredient or not being able to make a recipe.